In this video, we'll be discussing the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is considered to be the oldest book ever written. It gives us insight into what we could call ancient Babylonian polytheistic religion. Babylon was in Iraq, or an area we could call Mesopotamia or Sumerian, sometimes the cradle of civilization. And it represents a royal epic or great story of the ancient city of Uruk. That, coincidentally, is where we get the name of the country today, Iraq. Uruk became Iraq, in the same way that Woden becomes Woden's Day or Wednesday. This story was likely transmitted at first through oral storytelling, and that's why, once you've read it, you'll see that it has very repetitive sections, like choruses, that likely members of the community would have known and sung along with. This story is incredibly important for two special reasons. First off, it gives us a look at an ancient culture and its philosophy. What makes a great man? How to live a great life? Why the world is the way it is? But secondly, it has a couple of remarkable similarities with religious stories we are intimately familiar with in our society. As for what the significance of those similarities is, I'll have to leave to you to determine. However, the overlaps are obvious. The question, then, is simply, why? Why does this story bear so much in common with stories that are foundational to our society and its philosophy? This religion also includes a great goddess named Aruru. Aruru is the creator of humanity. When you have a female creator deity, oftentimes we'll use the word creatrix instead of creator to describe that being. Likely, it would have made sense for the Babylonians that the creator deity was female, because only women can give birth. Only women can create life. The main character of the Epic of Gilgamesh is described as 2/3 god and 1/3 man, a man of extreme feelings, and the god-king of the Sumerian city of Uruk. It's interesting to note that he's part god and part man, as this has similarities with other cultures we are familiar with. Specifically, our own, in which Jesus is described not as 2/3 God, 1/3 man, but as fully God and fully man at the same time. Secondly, it's curious by what ancestry someone could become 2/3 of one thing and 1/3 of another. You can be half and half, or a quarter and 3/4, but thirds is nonsensical in genetics. This might be our clue that there's something divine going on here. Much like the divine Trinity in Christianity. 3 gods as one God. Suffice it to say, Gilgamesh is more God than man. And that's relevant. He's also a god king, and we will have many god kings that we'll be discussing this semester. We already mentioned Jesus, who's King of Kings and Lord of Lords, both God and man. But we also have Hammurabi, who is considered to be a god king. The Emperor of Japan during World War II was considered to be a god king. The Egyptian pharaohs were god kings. The Roman Caesars were god kings. Montezuma in the Americas was considered to be a god king. And even today, Kim Jong-un of North Korea considers himself a self-styled god king. What's especially interesting here and elsewhere is the mixture of religion and politics. And that's especially philosophically relevant. We'll deal more with this overlap later and throughout the semester. For now, let's simply say that the most common relationship throughout the world's histories and cultures between religion and politics is one of complete or near complete mixture. What should be the proper relationship between religion and politics? Or what really is our political relationship between religion and politics in American government? Those questions I'd like you to keep in the back of your mind for now. Notice, lastly, that Gilgamesh is described as a man of extreme feelings. You might notice in the reading a section in which it is said that Gilgamesh embraces this other character, Enkidu, as a wife. This is especially relevant because it means that either Gilgamesh and Enkidu actually share a romantic, if not even sexually intimate relationship. But at the very least, Gilgamesh, as the greatest man in history, has no problem with physical intimacy with other men. That's not weak. That's not effeminate. Instead, that's manly. Gilgamesh's defining feature as a person is his emotion. Consider how very different this is from our society's gender norms and gender stereotypes. To embrace another man as a wife is not to merely give him what I like to call the bro hug. It's closeness. It's some degree of physical intimacy, which for Gilgamesh does not negatively impact his masculinity. Therefore, it's worthwhile to consider the different cultural conceptions of masculinity between our cultures and other cultures. We'll see this same feature later this semester when we discuss ancient Greek philosophy, in which homosexuality is not something which is dirty, bad, or immoral. Instead, it may indeed be divine. We'll see both there in ancient Greek philosophy, and we can make a parallel now with Native American spiritualities and culture, both of which considered that simply the gods make some people gay. That's how God made them. This is a different idea of how to understand human sexuality and its variety than is common in our culture today, as influenced specifically by Abrahamic religion. That is one of many benefits of studying other cultures and their philosophies. Enkidu is described as an equal and opposite other, created to balance out the power of Gilgamesh. He's described as a wild man, who's shaggy with hair and ate grasses with the gazelles. According to this description, Enkidu seems to be even more animal than man. If Gilgamesh was described as 2/3 god, 1/3 man, we might describe Enkidu as 1/3 man and 2/3 animal. In that case, what we have between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is what I've called a phenomenology of self. I won't take the time to explain that piece of vocabulary right this second. We'll have the opportunity for that later. What I mean is that for this ancient culture, these two characters describe what it means to be human. To be human is to be something divine above the animals. Something uniquely human, unlike the gods and unlike the animals. And something animalistic. We also see, especially in the character of Enkidu, what I've called here an origin of civilization mythos. What I mean by that is this story explains how humans ceased to be mere animals living in the forests among the other animals and became civilized city dwellers, truly human. For the Epic of Gilgamesh, this happens when the prostitute Shamat sleeps with Enkidu thus making it impossible for him to return to the animal world. In this sense, Enkidu stands in for all of us, ceasing to be animal and becoming human, explaining for this ancient culture what Darwin would explain in the 1800s, namely, how he left the animal world behind and became human. And that's remarkable to notice at the dawn of civilization. A story about why we are here and why we are different. The rest of philosophy will continue to attempt to deal with these questions in various ways, as we'll see throughout the semester. Lastly, Enkidu is described as a comrade who will save his friend. You might notice the similarities between this and John 15:13 from the New Testament. Love hath no greater man than this, that a man would lay down his life for his friends. We can call this theme or motif, which is recurrent in the world's cultures, salvationism, or the idea that salvation is good and needed. Certainly this occurs in Christianity, but in a number of other religions as well. The Code of Hammurabi has salvationist themes. For example, ultimately, Enkidu is adopted by Gilgamesh's mother, the goddess Remat-Ninsun, though it's difficult to tell whether he is a stepson to that goddess or a son-in-law. And ultimately, he dies after the battle with the guardian of the abode of the gods, Humbaba. We also see in the Epic of Gilgamesh the use of sacrifices, offerings, and prayers. And this is an important feature to pause and consider. Practically every single religion and culture in the world makes use of sacrifices, offerings, and prayers. This might raise two important questions. First off, why? Are they effective? If many people use them, that must mean they're true, right? Perhaps. But secondly, and very importantly, do you think it's the case that one person's prayer is as good as another's? Or does God and the gods only listen to the prayers of some and not to others? That challenging question impinges on another, which is, a motivational one for this course because of its importance to the history of Western philosophy. Why do the other religions exist? Is one as good as another? Is only one right and the rest wrong? Are they all divinely inspired, as Christian Unitarianism believes? Or Sikhism? Or are they all man-made? All merely human inventions? And all ultimately false? Or is only one right and the rest wrong? The way we answer this question will very likely affect the way we behave towards one another and people of other cultures. Should people be encouraged to leave their own religions and convert to another's? That question is similarly very challenging. How do we get what's called Christian evangelism and multiculturalism to coexist? I'd encourage you to think long and hard on those questions over the course of this semester. The rest of the story continues along in a somewhat straightforward manner. Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the bull of heaven, inviting the wrath of the gods, and Enkidu dies. Gilgamesh travels to the netherworld to rescue his friend and meets its scorpion being guardians. If you imagine the scaly bodies, the insectoid protrusions, and the stinging tails of these guardians of the underworld, likely there is some similarity between our culture's images of the denizens of the underworld, devils and demons with their long spiky tails and torturous pitchforks, and the pincers and stingers of these underworld inhabitants. Gilgamesh enters a supernatural garden, seeking eternal life, and finds there a brilliant blue fruit-bearing tree with precious stones for leaves, lapis lazuli. This is a magical tree unlike anywhere else in the known universe. And then the story cuts out. Whatever it is that Gilgamesh does in that supernatural garden with that supernatural tree on the quest for immortality, we don't know. That part of the story has been lost to history. It sounds remarkably like a sort of Garden of Eden, where immortality is within human grasp as well, and a central, pivotal idea is a supernatural tree of knowledge of good and evil. Perhaps that similarity is merely coincidental, Or perhaps this story, which is between 400 and 1300 years prior to the first time that the story of the Garden of Eden is written down, was transmitted from one culture to another through what's called cultural transmission. What Christians call the Old Testament, what Jews call the Torah and the Tanakh, was written during a period of time called the Babylonian exile in Babylon around 500 BC. That's the same city in which this story had existed for hundreds or nearly 1,000 years prior. The idea that this story was transmitted from one culture to another in a sort of telephone game is at least possible and considerable. Either it was or it was not. And the best we can do is try and uncover which is more likely. Though that I specifically entrust to you. Gilgamesh meets Utanapishtim, who tells Gilgamesh the story of how the gods told him to build a boat to bring all varieties of animals on to escape a global flood, how bread and wheat rained down from the sky, very similar to manna from heaven in the Old Testament, how the boat lodged on a mountain, and how Utanapishtim sent out birds 3 times until he was sure there was dry land. This story sounds remarkably like that of Noah, which was first written down hundreds of years later. Perhaps our archaeology or history is mixed up, or there's a conspiracy. Or perhaps that the Babylonians borrowed this story from the ancient Jewish people. It's difficult to tell. But the same question comes up either way. What is the significance of this similarity? And what does it matter? Is it as good to believe the story of Utanapishtim as Noah, if only the names have been changed? Or is it only right if you get the name right, and utterly useless if a tiny part is wrong or different? The Epic of Gilgamesh ends with Gilgamesh crossing the bottom of the ocean to find a plant like a box thorn, whose thorns will prick your hands like a rose, and is called The Old Man Becomes a Young Man. This is a plant with the power to rejuvenate, to make the old young again. It is the fountain of youth, the elixir of immortality. If Gilgamesh can take this plant back to his royal gardens and grow it, he can conquer death for everyone. No one in his city will die again because of his heroism. But if you've read, you know what occurs next. a wily snake comes along and ruins the chance at immortality for everyone. And when the snake still steals the boxthorn plant, it sheds its skin. It becomes young again. It's been rejuvenated. It casts off its wrinkly old man snake skin and has baby bottoms smooth, fresh young snake skin. This is called a pourquoi story, from the French, which means simply why. It explains why something happens, or why something in the world is the way it is. If you're a little Babylonian boy or girl and you ask your mother, "Mother, why does the snake shed its skin?" Your mother can answer, "Because Gilgamesh was going to make it so no one ever died again, but a snake ruined it for everyone." And so snakes can go back in time and go from being old to being young, but we humans cannot. That's mythological. And it explains something that we would explain as a natural phenomenon, molting. Snakes, just because of their biology, do this, as do lobsters and crabs, for example. But for this ancient people, the reason why that snake had that behavior is because of a story involving the gods. Notice also the remarkable, if not chilling, similarity between the role of the snake in this Babylonian polytheistic story, considered to be the oldest book ever written, and that of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, the reason why people die is because of a tricky snake. That tempts Eve, who tempts Adam. And thus death is a curse laid on all mankind since the beginning of time for their disobedience. This will, for much of the Western world, explain from their perspective why humanity is called fallen. That humanity lives under a curse. That originally all people were to be immortal. And were it not for a wily snake, we would have been. The same is true for the Babylonian mythology. If Gilgamesh had succeeded, all people would have been immortal. But because of the action of a wily snake, we're doomed to die. For Christianity, this comes to be called original sin. And it explains why death occurs. We can ask a couple of questions, which are perhaps the most important questions in human existence. Why do we die? In philosophy, we expect to ask the question, what is the meaning of life? We often don't realize that this comes with a corollary question. What is the meaning of death? Is death a natural process or a curse? In our next video, we'll continue to see similar stories from a variety of religions that accomplish similar purposes.